Hello, Joey. Thank you for your question about Honeycrisp apples. I think a very fitting question, knowing our enjoyment of apples. Um, and yeah, actually, I found some pretty interesting things about kind of the history of this apple and kind of some bigger thematic messages that this apple holds. Um, and so, yeah, I will just get started with kind of a little first before the Honeycrisp apple to just lay some foundational history. That in like the 1960s, you didn't really have many apple options when you went to the store. Basically, you kind of just had the Red Delicious. And this was definitely an era of like, we need to optimize products for mass production. And the Red Delicious was really good for that because it had a really tough skin, it was aesthetically pleasing, and was very easy to store and transport, which are all really important factors when trying to mass produce a fruit, especially. And it's something I'll talk about a bit later as well. But yeah, so the Red Delicious kind of came out on top, and I guess the taste was okay, but honestly, in today's standards, it's kind of mealy. Things started to change, though, in the 1970s when the Granny Smith apple was introduced to America from Australia. And this was almost like a wake up call for Americans that we can have different apples than just a Red Delicious. And the Granny Smith being so drastically different from a Red Delicious with its green skin and kind of more tart flavor, um, yeah, kind of opened us up to new flavors and textures that an apple can have. And then more and more varieties just started to hit the shelves that were suitable for mass production. And they were good, but I would say, um, and I think a lot of people, as my research has concluded, is like they were all just kind of eh. Like the Gala apple, Red Delicious, um, kind of none of them really hit the exact texture and flavor um, combination that like would make a perfect apple. Either they were too mealy or too dense or too tart maybe or just bland and so on. Okay, but then there's the Honeycrisp, which was originally crossbred in the late 1970s by Horticulture Research Center at the University of Minnesota. Did not expect Minnesota, but the Honeycrisp is a child of both the keepsake apple and some unreleased variety known as MN1627. And I tried to look for a keepsake, but I couldn't really find one. I don't know if they're still in production. They might have just kind of after the Honeycrisp came out, like probably no one even wanted this keepsake. It's probably just mid. Um, so yeah, I did not get one of those for this video. I apologize. But the University of Minnesota, where the Honeycrisp was invented, is kind of like the Harvard of apples, I guess you can say. And since 1908, they've planted more than 250,000 different apple trees, as in 250,000 different apple varieties. And out of those, only 29 have actually become commercial apple varieties that we see in the supermarket today. And I guess that's only a success rate of 0.01%. So in that case, I guess not really like Harvard, but you can argue that their rigorous scientific process and testing is similar to that of Harvard standards. Um, but yeah, with that testing, the apples at this research center do have to go through a lot to be deemed commercially viable. And obviously, a big part of that is taste. And the apple team at the University of Minnesota can taste up to 500 different apples in a single day, which is just crazy. They obviously don't actually eat 500 apples or even 500 bites of an apple. What they kind of do is just they bite into one, chew it, get the flavor and texture, and then kind of spit it out. But still, I feel like on your teeth, that just seems like a lot. But on top of both the taste and texture, apples also need to be resistant to diseases. They need to be able to withstand cold temperatures, store well for extended periods of time, like I mentioned before, and just kind of look like an aesthetically pleasing apple. And I think for appearance, the Honeycrisp apple is nice. I think it's like with some of that variety of like the lighter skin, with the red is a nice combination. Um, have I ever looked at a Honeycrisp apple more than when making this video? I don't think so. But yeah, it's a good apple. Um, However, the Honeycrisp apple was almost going to be discarded when it was first being tested. At the time when the tree was first planted of this variety, it was only labeled as MN1711. And because of a kind of a very harsh winter when this apple was first being grown, it almost just hit the compost pile, because if it can't withstand cold temperatures, then mass producing this apple is just not going to make sense. But somewhat on a whim, and somewhat because of how harsh that winter was compared to others, one of the horticulturists there, David Bedford, just decided to give the apple another shot. And in doing so, the apple eventually was deemed fit enough for commercial scale production, and then in 1991 was officially released to the public. And then the rest is history. Obviously, I'm joking. There's quite a lot more about the apple, the Honeycrisp apple, and its impact on our world, you can say. As you know now, the Honeycrisp apple ended up being a very popular apple. And I think I still remember, like, one of the first few times when I had one, and my mom just being like, oh, there's this crazy new apple at the store. And yeah, in a weird way, I think, or in a silly way, that the Honeycrisp apple is what made me fall in love with apples. Because like I was saying before, like all the varieties before Honeycrisp were kind of just eh. But something about the Honeycrisp just was so much better. And the University of Minnesota has a whole page on the Honeycrisp apple, and that's where I got some of this information. But I thought their way they described it was, I guess you could say eloquent, but a little odd. So I'll just read that now. Bite into the cream-colored flesh, and the large cells explode with juice in your mouth, carrying a delightful, well-balanced, subacidic, and mildly aromatic flavor. I think, in my opinion, they're doing a little too much with that description. I think they could maybe take a little bit out, maybe not say so many things, and also the cream-colored flesh, I think, is a stretch. I don't really see like any cream color in this apple, and just also saying cream-colored is, But the part about the cells bursting in your mouth, that is true. And all apples and fruits and vegetables have cells, obviously. And when you bite into them, you're basically breaking those cells, and that's what releases different flavors and aromatics, and also juice. And Honeycrisp apples are kind of built differently in that their cells are much larger than most other apple varieties. So when you bite into one, you get a sensation of a juicier apple because of those larger cells. I'm eating the Evercrisp right now, and it's kind of eh. It definitely doesn't have the same crunch that a Honeycrisp does. I think because of the different cell size. A little more sweet, and yeah, not as satisfying a crunch, and it really makes it kind of a worse apple in my opinion. The skin of a Honeycrisp apple is also more thin than other varieties, and that kind of also helps with texture and just eating experience, that it's very easy to bite into the skin. But that also leads to a downside, which I'll get into later. But yeah, kind of those two things are what makes eating a Honeycrisp apple quite enjoyable, on top of its good flavor. But I don't think this was the goal when they were originally crossbreeding those varieties, the keepsake and the unreleased variety. But it did end up being what made the apple so popular, which is pretty cool. Then in the early 2000s, so kind of like a decade after the apple was first released to the public, it kind of started popping off. That in 2006, first it became Minnesota's state fruit, which is kind of cool. But then, get this, was labeled or selected as one of the top 25 innovations in over a decade by the Better World Report, which this report, quote, honors significant academic research and technology transfer that has changed our way of life. And I don't know what that says about the other innovations at the time that an Apple got the slot in the top 25 of those innovations. But I guess it is a good Apple. I didn't know it could be considered something that has changed our way of life in ways that I think some other scientific discoveries probably have a little more. But you know what? It's a good Apple, so that's cool that this thing has that title. However, with all this rise to fame, as it seems always happens, there was a decline in quality when production had to be scaled up. And so just a little history on Apple storage and production beyond just the Honeycrisp. A lot of the storage happens in Washington State, which is the biggest producer of apples in the country and accounts for 65% of all fresh apple production in the United States. And that equates to roughly 10 to 12 billion apples every season, which crazy amount. And obviously we're not eating all of those apples in the few months or few weeks after those apples are picked. So large storage facilities are kind of needed to hold this quantity of apples and to allow us to enjoy them year round. And Honeycrisp apples can usually spend up to 7 months in a common storage, which is around 37 degrees Fahrenheit, which is kind of just like, yeah, a big fridge. And then it can spend 10 or more months in a reduced oxygen storage facility that's usually closer to like freezing temperature, around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And that reduced oxygen environment just helps slow down the oxidation process that happens in fruit that causes browning and softening, and so all good things if you want to keep a crisp apple for a very long time. So yeah, that's kind of just how apples are kind of stored in these crazy warehouses in Washington, which you don't expect. I think you often just associate apples with a nice quaint orchard on the countryside, and realizing that that's not true for most of the apples that you're getting, unless you're getting them locally or you're going to pick them yourself. But the transition from small farms in Minnesota, where the apple was first developed, to large-scale production in Washington kind of meant three major issues. One was Washington's climate is a lot warmer than Minnesota, which can make it more difficult to grow the fruit. And that's mainly because this warmer climate can lead to cells breaking down quicker and lead to a mealy texture and just a soft apple, which not very desirable. Two is that the thin skin that I mentioned earlier that kind of makes the eating experience of the apple so great also means that it's very susceptible to punctures and just sun exposure. And at a small scale, this is easier to deal with when maybe you only have to deal with like 1,000 apples or something. But when you scale this up to hundreds of thousands of apples, dealing with those issues becomes a lot harder. And one thing they have to do because they're very susceptible to punctures, usually that's from the stems of other apples in the bunch. And so the Honeycrisp apple their stem is very short. I feel like it is noticeably shorter than other apple varieties. I feel like some instances, like I can pick an apple up by the stem, but this one is just so, oh, okay, I kind of did that. But anyway, it's so short to prevent puncturing other apples, which kind of neat. Didn't really know that. Okay, that was two. And then the third main issue of kind of increasing scale is that just the inevitable degrading of quality when you're storing an apple for extended periods of time. And the Honeycrisps are some of the most prone to these long-term storage issues. Two notable ones are bitter pit and soft scald, which I didn't do too much research on those, but they result in browning and soft spots that obviously make the apple less desirable to a customer at the store. So likely if one gets too mushy, they're just gonna have to toss those. And the Honeycrisp is kind of the worst for those issues. However, even with all these issues that the Honeycrisp apple had over different varieties, its desirability and demand kind of meant that farmers were like, screw it, we're gonna grow this apple. And I think the extra effort also, on top of this high demand, just led to a higher price tag for this apple. So that just helps to improve their already very thin margins, because shocking, the apple industry is not a very profitable industry. Um, and I guess people in that industry are just doing it because they love apples. But when this Honeycrisp apple came out, they're like, oh, we can make this more profitable. So yes, it's kind of more of a pain in the ass to kind of grow and store, but the price and profit potentials outweighs those downsides. Unfortunately, though, many farms were not really equipped to kind of handle these more difficult aspects of harvesting and storing these apples when transitioning to a larger scale in Washington. And that kind of inevitably meant a decline in quality. And I mean, obviously, there are good Honeycrisp apples out there. I think when you go to the store and you get a good Honeycrisp apple, it's a good apple. But I would say more often than not now, when I get a Honeycrisp apple, it's just kind of eh. And I think we've talked about this in the past, so I think you agree with that. And yeah, just kind of unfortunate to see that. And part of it has just been trying to upscale production so much because of demand that you inevitably lost some of that quality. And an apple variety like the Cosmic Crisp, which you so kindly introduced me to, I think doesn't have some of these issues. And a main thing is that each Cosmic Crisp, I guess, tastes like a Cosmic Crisp. And that consistency is something that is very nice and appreciated by a lot of customers. And that is why you do see these newer varieties kind of becoming more popular. Who's to say that they're not also going to be susceptible to some of these issues of scaling up production at some point, and maybe Cosmic Crisp will one day kind of just be eh. But right now, I feel like it's having a win over the Honeycrisp. So yeah, that is the history of the Honeycrisp apple. It was a variety that was almost discarded because of its poor performance in its first year of growing, but then became one of the most highly demanded apple varieties out there in the country and maybe the world. But then unfortunately, that popularity is also what led to almost its decline, in that the inevitable truths of scaling up production, especially when you're doing it too fast to keep up with this high demand, led to a decline in quality. And I think that is a good message for other things in life too. Like, I think one thing this really made me think about was just the whole AI boom and this insatiable need almost to integrate AI into every aspect of our lives. And we've seen that firsthand of like, oh, can we put AI in this? Can we make it part of our workflow? Can we create videos with it? And not really understanding its potential and best applications and some of the consequences for using it. And obviously easier said than done, but I don't know, I feel like when you get excited about new things, trying to slow down and take your time with that rather than just kind of jump into the deep end. Obviously, it's so much easier to do that. And when everyone else around you is moving super fast, it's hard to just sit back and let that happen. And I don't know the right solution to that. I think we talked about data centers at my job and how their desire to kind of be involved with that process, and their reasoning just being, oh, everyone else is investing in data centers, so we should invest in them too. And everyone is loving and growing these Honeycrisp apples, so we should just do that too. And obviously, the impact that Honeycrisp apples has on our global economy and environment is a lot smaller than that of AI. But they both share this thing in common of this desire to jump on the popularity train. And I don't know how it seems to always lead to negative outcomes, but I'm not really sure how to better approach that when it's just our natural desire to do that, to go fast when something new and exciting happens. But yeah, anyway, my question for you is about elevation and altitude. And this was inspired by me being in Colorado this past weekend and obviously being short of breath. And for one hike that we did, just kind of definitely having some mild symptoms of altitude sickness, of just a bad headache and nausea. And that is very more commonly known, but something I did not know when being there, especially in Breckenridge, which has an elevation of like 9,000 feet, is that you lose around 30% of your taste at higher elevation. And I just thought, what an interesting, almost unintended consequence of higher elevation. Also, like you can be, I feel like you become a lightweight when you're at a higher elevation and alcohol just affects you more. And I guess my question is, what are some of the unintended consequences, you could say, of higher elevations? You could look, I'm curious about those two that I mentioned, but also are there any other weird things that either A, happen in the human body with when you're in an oxygen deprived environment, or just to other animals or the environment? I was going to take a bite of this apple, but I just had breakfast and I don't really want to eat an entire apple right now. So you just get one last look at the apple. Okay, goodbye.